Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Friends of the show, Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter, join me for a special two-part series on the Khashoggi Affair, done in a roundtable format and released in two separate episodes in the coming week for our listeners, or available in advance in full for patrons. Kyle Anzalone is the host of Foreign Policy Focus podcast and the editor-in-chief of ImmersionNews.com. He also writes the daily news roundup at the Libertarian Institute. Will Porter is a freelance journalist with a focus on U.S. foreign policy and conflicts abroad. His work can be found at the Libertarian Institute, Antiwar.com, and Consortium News. This discussion was recorded in two sessions on November 23rd and 24th, 2018. This is part 2. And we can go into what John Brennan's been saying, but I think that Bruce Riedel, also, he's ex-CIA, I think he's a little bit more, he gives a little bit more detail about it, but Angry Arab didn't really emphasize it, but I've seen other people say that he's not controllable, that MBS is not controllable, and that's the main problem. I'm going to add another audio clip in here. This is Bruce Riedel in the Off the Hookah podcast on October 31st, 2018. It's episode 75, titled Crown Control.
I think the Crown Prince position is more fragile than it appears from the outside. From the outside, he has successfully diminished all of the other power centers, the National Guard, the Ministry of Interior. But in the process of doing so, he has alienated many members of the royal family. For example, Prince Turki bin Abdullah Al Saud, one of the sons of the last king, has been imprisoned now for over a year. We don't know where he is. The son of King Fahd has been missing for the last year, presumed dead. Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, the former interior minister, former crown prince, is effectively under palace arrest, held incommunicado. You can't do that kind of thing in Saudi society or any society without making a lot of enemies. Now, of course, he has created a culture of fear in the kingdom. People are intimidated for understandable reasons, and the Khashoggi thing only reinforced that. But cultures of fear not only intimidate people, they also breed conspiracies. People begin planning, what are they going to do to end this? And that's where I think the Crown Prince's position is very fragile. He is a prime target for assassination, and he knows it. And his lifestyle has changed to try to prevent it, but it's very difficult at the end of the day to ensure 100% security. In addition, there are a lot of people whispering in the ears of his father. The Crown Prince is a reckless danger, threat to the House of Saud. You've got to remove him. 6 months ago, the Crown Prince came to the United States. He was feted from Cambridge to Silicon Valley to Hollywood to Wall Street. He was portrayed as a brave reformer who was remaking the Middle East. A lot of opinion columnists touted him in their columns, ignoring the fact that by this point he had involved the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for 3 years in a brutal war in Yemen, which was creating a humanitarian catastrophe. Those days are over. He's not going to be welcomed in Hollywood. He's not going to be welcomed in Silicon Valley. He's a pariah now. And that has forced the Trump administration to start to come to terms with it. Very, very reluctantly. The Crown Prince's reckless decision-making, most famously in Yemen, but we've seen it in a lot of other things, Khashoggi, Qatar, the Ritz-Carlton, has made Saudi Arabia, for the first time in 50 years, not a bastion of stability in the region, but a force for instability at home and in the region. This is very bad news for all Western governments, but the United States in particular. Saudi Arabia has been the rock around which we built our foreign policy in the region for 75 years now, and the Trump administration has done that more enthusiastically and more crudely than any administration before. But a Saudi government which is fragile at home could have very unpredictable internal evolution. Crown Prince could be assassinated. Who knows what could happen? It also has broad regional impact. Countries that live in Saudi Arabia's shadow, if you like Bahrain being an extreme example, Jordan being an example, all of the Gulf states. If Saudi Arabia gets a cold, they get pneumonia. There are already people circling to take advantage of this. And the first to come racing in was the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, who went to Saudi Arabia before the Khashoggi Affair and asked for money and was turned down, and went after the Khashoggi Affair and got more money than he had asked for the first time. He effectively shook down the Saudi Crown Prince for $6 billion, at least $6 billion. It's probably more than that. And there will be others who do the same, who will come in now and say, yes, I'll have my picture taken with you, but here's the price tag. That, again, is not good for the United States. We have a dangerous, very mercurial leader who has a pattern of making mistakes, and you can be certain another mistake is coming. Another big mistake will come. It's time for the Trump administration to put some distance between itself and Mohammed bin Salman. State Department statement saying the hostilities in Yemen should come to an end is the beginning of that wedge. It's got a long way to go, but it's the beginning of that wedge. They will have to do more, because when Congress reconvenes after the midterms, the subject of Saudi Arabia, Jamal Khashoggi, and Mohammed bin Salman will be high on the agenda, not just of the Democrats, but at least of some of the Republicans. The Congress cannot force Mohammed bin Salman out of the line of succession. The United States can't do it. But it can bring an end to the war in Yemen. And I think the administration knows that if it doesn't act first, its hands are going to be tied by the Congress. They're going to demand an end to our support for the war in Yemen. And it would be better from the administration's standpoint if they arrange a deal with the Saudis. The essence of the deal is, let's change the conversation. Let's stop talking about Mr. Bonesaw and start talking about peace in Yemen. It doesn't resolve the Khashoggi Affair, which won't go away, but it does change the narrative, and I think that's what the administration is belatedly starting to do.
Yeah, I could see there definitely being sort of a divide between like the inner factions of the CIA and stuff, and who they would back versus like Trump and the rest of the administration. I think Trump obviously does have an incentive. I think, as Abu Khalil was saying there, to get behind bin Salman. He's got this guy. He's got him right where he wants him. They're great partners and stuff. But other parts of the establishment probably are more interested in something more stable.
Yeah, my guess is that it's just a super complicated situation again, where I'm sure maybe the Pentagon has somebody they prefer, the CIA has somebody they prefer, the arms makers has somebody they prefer, and of course, not talked about in any of that was Jared Kushner, who has a very close relationship with Donald Trump and Mohammed bin Salman. I do think that the most apt part of that analysis is that probably Saudi Arabia will be somewhat indebted to, or at least Mohammed bin Salman. I think Trump will perceive him as being somewhat indebted to him. Now, maybe Mohammed bin Salman is just so reckless that he's really not going to care. But we are seeing, I read today from the Reuters wire, that Saudi Arabia is producing a record amount of oil, pumping a record amount of oil. And so I saw a couple days ago on Twitter, Trump thanking himself for, the low oil prices. And of course, if, I think he's looking to sell a good economy, one thing that sells a good economy is low gas prices. And and so maybe Trump trying to keep the gas price at that level where the shale oil is still profitable, but at the same time gas prices are low. And if he wants to exert pressure on not only Iran but also Syria, Libya, and Saudi or Venezuela, then he's got to have to have the Saudis pretty much in line with how much oil they're producing. And so I think there's a lot more factors at play than just those kind of few things that that analysis listed. But I think the big thing here is that Trump is going to try to put a lot of pressure on Mohammed bin Salman now. And my guess is that one of the outlets, it doesn't look like it's going to be the war in Yemen that he's going to try and make Mohammed bin Salman knock off. It's going to be the oil prices.
Yeah, I think you're right in that there are so many factors here. And the other factor is the political factor here at home, right? So you got the faction who's trying to get back into power, trying to leverage this for, to take down Trump. They're still trying to take down Trump. This might be a good time then I want to go into a little more about what the CIA has indicated. But because we're talking about this, there's an analysis by Moon of Alabama on November 21st titled, "Keeping bin Salman in Place Will Hurt Trump's Middle East Policies." And I have some excerpts here where he talks about Bruce Riedel. He's ex-CIA, and he's been one of the key voices on this over the last few months. And I should say it has started not long before, but at least a week before the Khashoggi murder. He was already on this track. And anyway, Moon of Alabama says, Riedel warned that the Trump administration, by betting on Mohammed bin Salman, put everything on one dubious card. MBS is unstable and made himself many internal enemies. If King Salman suddenly dies, there will probably be a leadership crisis. And he links to that AP article that we read earlier in the podcast. Saudi Arabia could end up in chaos. U.S. Middle East policy, largely built around MBS, would then fall apart. And he refers to this article that Riedel published in Al Monitor on September 23rd. So that's about 1 week before Khashoggi was murdered on October 2nd. So this is a week before, where he said, quote, "Saudi Arabia is at its least stable in 50 years, unquote, since King Faisal removed his incompetent and corrupt brother Saud from the throne in 1964. And it's kind of interesting he brings up that particular incident. And then he's by removing, and in this situation, before MBS became the crown prince and next in line to the throne, there were two guys ahead of him. This Prince Makreen, I think he's a half brother of the current king, and then Mohammed bin Nayef, the MBN, long relationship with the CIA, and he's kind of like I've always understood him to be our guy in Saudi Arabia. And they were removed from the line of succession. So MBS is set to be king. And MBS's sins, in Riedel's analysis here, are the war in Yemen, the blockade of Qatar, and the fact that he said he wants to fight Iran inside. He wants a war with Iran, a real war. And also that the Aramco deal, the King Salman supposedly killed the Aramco deal. He says, quote, fearing for his security, the Crown Prince is said to spend many nights on his $500 million yacht moored in Jeddah. That particular detail got a lot of press coverage, and I think, Rydell put it there for a reason. And then he says, another quote, he says, if the king dies suddenly and soon, the succession may be disputed and even violent. And another quote is, the Trump administration has given Saudi Arabia a blank check and supports its war in Yemen. The Crown Prince has been touted by the White House. It's a foolish and dangerous approach. And then he wraps up the article by saying that MBS better end that war in Yemen. It surprised me how he ended that, because I'm not completely convinced that the U.S. really wants to end that war in Yemen. I think they just may have some different ideas about how to do it. Continuing with Moon of Alabama's analysis, he says, the CIA disliked MBS since he replaced Mohammed bin Nayef as Crown Prince. MBN is a longtime U.S. asset with a proven record of cooperation. MBS came from nowhere, and the CIA has no control over him. That he is indeed impulsive and reckless only adds to that. That the CIA feared that MBS meant trouble even before the Khashoggi disaster explains why it sabotaged Trump's attempts to exculpate MBS over the murder of Khashoggi. And he means the CIA. Trump was working on exculpating MBS, and the CIA jumped in and, sabotaged that, basically. Moon of Alabama says, while Rydell was writing about the Saudi danger, Jamal Khashoggi, a longtime Saudi intelligence agent who had aligned himself with the wrong prince, went to Istanbul to build the public relations infrastructure for regime change in Saudi Arabia. So basically, and this I hadn't seen before Moon of Alabama brought this up, there was an article in the AP by Sarah Al-Deeb on October 12th, and it's titled, Missing Saudi Writer Had Big Plans for Troubled Region. And Moon of Alabama just excerpts a little bit of it. He says, Jamal Khashoggi, a prolific writer and commentator, was working quietly with intellectuals, reformists, and Islamists to launch a group called Democracy for the Arab World Now. He wanted to set up a media watch organization to keep track of press freedom. He also planned to launch an economic-focused website to translate international reports into Arabic to bring sobering realities to a population often hungry for real news, not propaganda. Part of Khashoggi's approach was to include political Islamists in what he saw as democracy building. Khashoggi had incorporated his democracy advocacy group, Dawn, in January in Delaware, said Khalid Safuri, another friend. The project was expected to reach out to journalists and lobby for change, representing both Islamists and liberals. So, remember earlier we were talking about how, this looks like a regime change operation in Saudi Arabia, but it didn't look like our usual regime change operation. Like this does. This looks, the whole democracy, freedom and democracy thing.
Right. That's funny. I have this in my notes too, this Dawn organization. I kind of have like a question, like, was this perhaps like meant to stir up some trouble in Saudi Arabia, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, and I've been thinking that like it's not plausible that Khashoggi's like activities just as a columnist or something that has inspired that much hatred or anger among Saudi royals or Mohammed bin Salman. It seems like there has to be something more there, and this Dawn thing. And if perhaps he was like trying to secure funding from Turkey or Qatar, which are obviously Saudi regional rivals, that would kind of give a plausible motivation, I think, more so than just like what he's writing in the Washington Post or in Al Watan or whatever.
Yeah, it sounds more like an Obama era.
Like the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy kind of type operations.
I just can't remember the term that we use for this kind of like color revolution kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this would certainly not have just been Khashoggi. This would have been a much bigger operation, and it would be, by this faction, the Brennan, the Rydell, the Samantha Powers, that whole faction of the global elite or the deep state or whatever you want to call them. But anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting, and I'll just read the rest of what I've excerpted here from Moon of Alabama. He says Khashoggi's projects were allegedly financed by Qatar, but probably also had CIA support. MBS got wind thereof. He told his private office chief, Badr al-Asakar, to send his bodyguards to kill Khashoggi. They did so on October 2nd in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, but it was much too large and too complicated mission. The Saudi agents made too many mistakes. They also underestimated the Turkish intelligence service. In another excerpt, Trump will get much criticism from the Foreign Policy Board for burying the case like this, but that criticism is over style, not substance. U.S. support for bloody dictators is the rule, not the exception, but that still leaves concern that Trump bet his whole Middle East policy on his relations with the Saudis. And even as parts of it already fail, he continues to do so. Trump's priorities in the Middle East are the deal of the century for Israel, the forging of the United Arab Front against Iran, weapons sales, cheap oil, and a minor issue like financing the U.S. occupation of Syria and ending the unsavory war on Yemen. None of these issues has seen any success. And then I'll just summarize the failures that he lists here. He says the plan, the Middle East Grand Bargain, the Israel-Palestine plan, the Kushner Netanyahu MBS plan. He calls it the Israel-Palestine plan. He says that whole thing has stalled. They did the embassy move, which was sort of supposed to kick it off. And after that, they were supposed to sort of disenfranchise, just take away all Palestinian rights, disenfranchise them, and have the Saudis pay them off. And as it turns out, that King Salman, he won't agree to further disenfranchising the Palestinians. So that whole Kushner Grand Bargain thing is stalled. And then he says Trump asked the Saudis to reconcile with Qatar. That was one of his other demands, and then fund an Arab NATO led by the U.S. But the Saudis, they rejected that because, as someone else said earlier, Qatar is almost even a bigger enemy to the Saudis than Iran at this point. And they just were like, no, we're not doing that. They consider them a threat. Also, the Saudis, they're not following through on the big weapons deals that they were supposed to do, that Trump wants them to do. And they're even looking into Russian weapons, which is, as you can imagine, the reaction to that by our military industrial complex. Saudis, they raised the oil production, but they're also furious because Trump gave out all those sanctions waivers for Iranian oil. And so for how long MBS is going to continue to produce more oil is sort of precarious because of that. Also, the Yemen war is continuing. There's not much change to that. And the Saudis, they're supposed to, Trump always says, well, we should get somebody else to pay for our wars in the Middle East. And the Saudis are supposed to cough up, I don't know, $250 billion for the U.S. occupation of Syria. And I think they've only come up with a fraction of that. And lastly, Trump is counting on MBS being indebted to him, that he'll follow his orders. But in Moon of Alabama's view, his personality indicates that he probably won't. So, in other words, Moon of Alabama is saying that Trump's going to lose this battle about MBS. And he's not even winning it. He's not even getting the things that he's supposed to get by having MBS as his cooperative partner or puppet in Saudi Arabia. And also the last thing is Moon of Alabama speculates that because MBS is going to that G20, he thinks that Erdogan may pull some trick, like releasing those tapes or something, while all the world leaders are gathered in Argentina, which will, God only knows what kind of chaos that will cause. But I think that's likely. And frankly, I think that, the CIA faction, that Rydell and Brennan, and I don't know I wish we could come up with a name for this sort of deep state faction, but I don't think they would be sad if Erdogan did that. So that's Moon of Alabama's take on it. I thought that was there were a couple things in there I hadn't known before, and otherwise, as he usually does, it's just a nice, concise analysis that sort of explains the situation or possibility of what is really going on with this.
Yeah, kind of got me thinking now. If you kind of look at like the positions of Trump and Mohammed bin Salman, they're kind of like, I don't know if you'd say totally similar, but Trump has a sort of hostile like establishment behind him, not supporting him, a deep state that seems to be sort of trying to stymie his moves. And then you have Mohammed bin Salman, who has consolidated decision making in Saudi a lot, but does not. It seems to be kind of shaky. It seems like both are leaders who don't have like the broader establishments of their societies fully behind them. So it's just kind of interesting thing there.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a few things. I think I don't know. You could I think estimate the importance of the CIA just assessment on. I mean, it's possible that the CIA is playing politics and looking to like reinstall MBN or kick out MBS. It's also possible. I mean, we've heard this a few times now that these Saudi officials are bringing up, U.S. torture and stuff like that, and that's something that Gina Haspel is probably not too pleased with. And so, I mean, the reason for the leak could be as simple as that. I mean, at the end of the day, these are all people, and they could be pretty petty at times. And maybe some people are actually upset by what's going on, with the Khashoggi murder and all of that. I guess a little skeptical about the claim that this was all about Khashoggi going to meet with the Qataris about forming up like a new media organization. One reason, I guess, is just the lack of and them trying to use this as like a springboard to like create it in Khashoggi's image. I mean, if you want to do the a color revolution or something like that, then pick up the banner and say, this is what Khashoggi died for. Everybody, let's go out and support this thing. This is that important. And so I'm not sold, I guess, on the idea that it was over that, or there's the allegations of white phosphorus that he was going to expose proof of that, or just different. I've heard several different kinds of war crimes of Saudi Arabia that he was possibly going to expose, and that was the reason for his murder. One interesting thing that I just realized as Joanne was talking there was that the G20 summit is in Argentina, and I'm reading here today from Middle East Eye that Argentina has opened up an inquiry on whether to press criminal charges against Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for his role leading the Saudi-led military campaign in Yemen. And so
it begins.
Right. And I believe if you're trying to prosecute somebody for war crimes and the home country won't do it, then they could arrest him, just like, CIA officials have almost been arrested in European countries. And so, not that it's going to get interesting, but if Erdogan would have done something like, dropped some proof that it was 100% Mohammed bin Salman who ordered a nasty hit. They've even potentially talked about torture here, to show the world that while Mohammed bin Salman is in Argentina could be dangerous for him.
Yeah, I think the message would be that I think they're saying you better not come here. Don't you? It sounds to me like they're afraid that he's going to go to this G20 and he's just going to start being normalized again, or maybe I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe they're afraid that some world leaders are cozy up to him because after all, they still do have a lot of money and everybody's always trying to shake them down for some money.
Yeah, that could be the Argentinian play. I will say, as far as I think Moon of Alabama talked a little bit about what Trump was interested in from the Saudis. I think the two big things for him are the weapon sales and the oil. I think, Donald Trump sees dollar signs in pretty much everything. And I don't know how many barrels of oil or how many, sorry, dead, starved to death, many babies he would trade for a barrel of oil, but I'm guessing it's a couple thousand. So, um, yeah. I think I just wanted to point out that I think I disagree a little bit with Trump's interest in what he wants to get from Saudi Arabia, and I think that he may be able to exert the pressure to get at least some of those concessions, specifically the weapon sales. Manipulating the oil price might be a little bit harder, just because, as I think Essa Bloomy has pointed out on this show, Joanne, that Saudi Arabia isn't in great economic position, and so maybe they can afford to, play a losing hand with their oil at this point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'm seeing it almost like I see these two large factions, and they have different ideas about the future for the Middle East. And maybe you could sort of break it down sort of to oversimplify it. Is everyone who supports the Iran deal or supported the Iran deal, and everyone who wanted to tear down the Iran deal. I don't know if it's as simple as to call it the neoconservative foreign policy, but maybe it is. Um, but I think that if Issa Bloomy is right, and he makes a pretty good argument that Saudi Arabia is about to collapse. So there's a big opportunity right now to sort of reshape the region. And one way to do it is the Vision 2030, which, MBS, it's a dubious vision. It's sort of question, but it leaves the Saudi king in place. It kind of like leaves the same structure for the Gulf State Council and just tries to modernize Saudi Arabia. And what they don't mention is that they need more oil to do this. They need to get some control of resources in Yemen, and control of ports in the Red Sea, and although they're sort of dividing that up with the United Arab Emirates, because MBS's partner in this supposedly is MBZ, who's the emir of Abu Dhabi. And I don't want to get in too much to that, but in the Yemen war, there's the Yemen war, Saudi coalition versus Yemen, but there's also the almost unspoken rivalry between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi over, control of specific things in Yemen. But anyway, just to get back on track, so you have that faction, the MBS faction, and then you have the everyone who supported the Iran deal. I mean, I think the way I understand it, I think what their goal was a balance of power in the Middle East, to recognize that Iran is a regional power, and one that the Saudi power needs to be offset. I think their vision might be, and we're getting some clues that it might be, to really to change Saudi Arabia, fundamentally change it. I don't know how much they're really interested in democracy. Generally, their kind of democracy means, you know, some dubious elections and putting someone in power who they can trust, a strong man, and then creating a 1%, creating a power elite at the top who are, enriched, and things that they've done in many countries, to just change it from the royal system that they've got right now. And I think I don't know what their plans are for Qatar, because the people who support the Iran deal also seem to be favor Qatar a little more. And Qatar is, of course, willing to deal with Iran, so that's convenient. But anyway, that's the two factions that I see sort of battling right now. And I think that they see this as a moment where things could go one way or they could go another way. And, their long-term plans were for it to be this regional balance of power situation and restructuring Saudi Arabia. Whereas the other side, the neoconservative foreign policy side, I mean, we've gotten a glimpse of what they have in mind, right? They want to redraw the maps of the Middle East and things like that. What is his name? Jeffrey Goldberg published some things in the Atlantic about that. So underneath it all, and I think there's even more to it than this, but underneath it all, I think it's sort of this old battle playing itself out. So when I say CIA, I really mean that faction, that pro-Iran deal faction.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally that makes sense. I think to some extent, this is just the people who have any comprehension of what the Middle East actually looks like at all versus the rest of them. It's pretty clear that what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen is absolutely like just the most horrific kind of war crime, like the kind of war crime where you bomb a flock of sheep to make sure that the children starve to death. That's what kind of war Yemen is. And so I think even people like Rand Paul, who actually, I believe, initially opposed the Iran deal. Now, I think this is mostly for political reasons, and he kind of did some cognitive dissonance there and used like the Constitution as a shield from him actually taking the correct stand on that position. But they have, since really shifted their position, and I think understanding it, like the severity of the situation, especially in Yemen and the Middle East, but just how far the U.S. is siding with Saudi Arabia has definitely changed some people's position. And also, you have some like odd things going on, like right now, like Lindsey Graham is on the MBS must go bandwagon, but certainly isn't, have any like realistic view of the Middle East or has any desire to shift away from, like kind of the pro Saudi policy whatsoever.
Yeah, like when we talk about some of these factions here too, I sometimes wonder, like, we talk about their motivations and maybe their visions of the Middle East. Now, when it comes to the CIA and stuff, I definitely think they have probably deeper ambitions and goals. However, just in terms of like who's participating in the public discussion and discourse, some of these people I think don't really have much deeper motivations at all, and a lot of it's very kind of surface level politics. There's sort of been a line about Trump that says that he supports dictators and that he's a fan of dictators. And so, hey, look, this dictator in Saudi Arabia has just done this terrible thing, or we're saying he did. And so let's tie Trump to that and try to sling some mud at him for that reason. I definitely think that's at least some part of this. Certainly not all of it, but there's some, fraction of this scandal that is that.
Right. That's definitely why, you just hear people talking about this one a little bit more than they typically would anything that's happening in the Middle East. Is because there's a really an easy slam against Trump for backing another dictator.
Yeah, those are really good points. Especially Lindsey Graham. I mean, it's hard to understand what that guy's doing. And the other thing that's complicating the whole situation is that there are people who are trying to continue. It's almost like the Russiagate thing has kind of collapsed and they're sort of switching over to the Khashoggi thing because they still want to take down Trump, right? And every party wants to take down the other party, but it's on steroids at this point. I mean, so you have like U.S. domestic politics, in the mix. I don't remember Graham's did McCain he opposed the Iran deal, right?
Yeah,
I honestly don't remember, but I'm sure he did.
Yeah, so that definitely doesn't fit. And Rand Paul, though he may have technically opposed it, everything he says is sort of, he defends Iran, he condemns the war in Yemen. He has a lot to say about all of this. But since we were talking about, just get this other clip. I don't know if this is a good time to bring it in or not, but I do have a clip from two clips put together from Lindsey Graham, what he's saying, and I have Rand Paul's. Should we delve into the American politics part of it now, or should we play out the CIA part of it?
I feel like we kind of just like what we just talked about would be a good segue into the politics thing, definitely.
Yeah. So anyway, this is Lindsey Graham 2 days apart. So, essentially within the same week, these are things that he said.
I want to go to Saudi Arabia here for a minute. We here at NBC News have confirmed that the CIA has concluded that the Crown Prince himself, Mohammed bin Salman, ordered the assassination of the Washington Post journalist and columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Do you accept that assessment?
I haven't been briefed, but I believe from day one that 15 people, 18, whatever the number was, they don't get on two airplanes, go to Turkey and chop a guy up in the consulate who's a critic of the Crown Prince without the Crown Prince having known about it and sanctioned it. If you know anything about Saudi Arabia and anything about MBS, the fact that he didn't know about it is impossible for me to believe. If he is going to be the face and the voice of Saudi Arabia going forward, I think the kingdom will have a hard time on the world stage. They're an important ally, but when it comes to the Crown Prince, he's irrational, he's unhinged, and I think he's done a lot of damage to the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and I have no intention of working with him ever again.
All right, well, the president seems hesitant to name MBS, which is what he's affectionately known, using Mohammed bin Salman there for viewers.
Yeah.
But I noticed he was not on the sanctions list. Is that a mistake?
Well, I want to see what the CIA says, but I'm working with Senator Menendez to invoke the Magnitsky Act to all concerned. And we're not going to make these 15 Saudi security agents the fall guy here. I'm going to do whatever I can to place blame where I believe it lies. I'm going to put it at the feet of the Crown Prince, who has been a destructive force in the Mideast. He embargoed Qatar without telling anybody. This war in Yemen's got completely out of control. He put the Prime Minister of Lebanon under house arrest. It's clearly this guy's a wrecking ball when it comes to the Mideast in a relationship with the United States. And I hate to say that because I had a lot of hope for him for being the reformer that Saudi Arabia needs. But that ship has sailed as far as Lindsey Graham's concerned.
Why do you think the president and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who I know became quite close to MBS, why are they so insistent on trying to salvage MBS here?
Yeah. Well, I think it's an important relationship, and I'm not telling Saudi Arabia who to make Crown Prince or who to put in charge of their country. It's up to them. I am trying to tell them and the world that when it comes to the Crown Prince that exists today, I think he has shown a lack of appreciation for the relationship.
Right.
He's stepped all over our values. He's put us in a box, and I'll leave it up to the president to find out how to handle Saudi Arabia from the executive branch side. From the legislative branch side, we're going to do as much as we can, as hard as we can, to send a signal to the world. This is not the way we expect an ally to act. What happened in Turkey violates every norm of civilized society, and it will not stand. And if John McCain were alive today, he'd be the first one saying that.
The Crown Prince's brother is, of course, the ambassador to the United States. His phone call to Khashoggi is one of the pieces of evidence used to conclude that, yes, this was an order from MBS. Should he be welcomed back to the United States ever again as an ambassador?
No.
Yeah. All right, let me turn to another. I have your statement on Saudi Arabia. I don't think there's been anyone in the media more critical, more regularly, for
That's
more
for sure.
years than
That's
me
for sure.
of Saudi Arabia. How they treat women, gays, lesbians, Christians, and Jews are persecuted. With that said, I believe MBS did know and probably ordered the killing of this Jamal Khashoggi. Here's the problem we have. World War II, we had to align with a mass murderer by the name of Joseph Stalin to defeat Hitler.
Right.
We didn't like that alliance either. Right now, we have a historic moment where U.S., Israel, Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, the Saudis are now perfectly aligned against Iranian hegemony and the threats of them getting a nuclear weapon with their radical ideology of wanting to destroy the world and America and Israel.
Right.
I think there should be, I agree with you about sanctions. I agree there needs to be a punishment. But I also agree with the president. We should not end this relationship.
Yeah, and I'm not talking about ending the relationship. Everything you said is true about the strategic nature of the relationship. But here's what I believe. Saudi Arabia needs us more than we need them. It's not too much to ask an ally not to butcher a guy in a consulate. This is not World War II, so I'm not going to look away at what MBS did. I think he did it. I think he's absolutely crazy about what he's done in the Mideast.
Isn't there also a danger, though, that we push him into the arms? He would he would have more strategic alliances. We'd throw him into the arms of Putin, Iran, Syria, and China.
Well, I'll be honest with you, Sean. There's no way Saudi Arabia ever is going to align with Iran. They're mortal enemies. If they want to buy arms from Russia, fine.
I got it.
The bottom line here is I care about the strategic relationship. I'm going to support Israel completely, but I'm not going to turn my back on this guy. We've got a historic opportunity here to tell the people in the Mideast there's a new sheriff in town. If you disrespect us and you trample over civilized norms, you're going to pay a price. If you want to keep MBS, that's your decision to make, Saudi Arabia. As long as you make that decision, you're going to have a hard time with me. If you want to replace him with somebody who's not crazy, that would be a good move.
Yeah, I agree with you wholly. All right. As it goes with the president.
It's not complicated for me. I like Saudi Arabia. This guy's crazy and he needs to go.
But he's got to go. I actually really believe we have a moment in history that never existed before. This strategic alliance could actually be
100%.
the moment where we find peace in the Middle East. The Iranians are far too dangerous. We cannot allow that moment to come when they have nukes. Let me ask you. So now
radical Islam with a nuclear weapon is really dangerous.
That's a bad scenario.
So that's two different things on the 18th and the 20th.
I mean, the most amazing thing about that is at one point, Hannity is such a warmonger that even Lindsey Graham has to walk him back. And he's like, let's not get carried away with ourselves. If we stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, they're not going to ally with Iran, which, he's going on about how we need Saudi Arabia for, to counter Iran. Then he's like, if we stop arming Saudi Arabia, they'll go to Iran. His fear mongering is absolutely insane. I mean, most of that interview is just two insane people talking who have no actual conception of the Middle East. I mean, I guess Lindsey Graham's is a little bit better, but the fact that they're worried about Iran getting a nuclear weapon at this point is insane, and not realizing that the Iran nuclear deal was the only thing, if we were really, really concerned that Iran was getting a nuclear weapon, that would have been the thing that would have let us know if they were developing one, which they weren't. And, so they're not a fan of that. Their whole Iran policy and their conception of Iran and what is mistaken. The fact that they say that, the worst thing in the world will be the Iranians getting a nuclear weapon because that would be, Islamic extremists with a nuclear weapon, when, you have Saudi Arabia arming and backing the actual jihadists in Syria alongside the United States all these years. And the fact they also mentioned that, this is going to drive Saudi Arabia into the hands of Syria. He's just trying to say scary regimes. It's so little of actual substance. But, it's important to just kind of remember that the whole frame of that debate that Sean Hannity and Lindsey Graham are having is it too much of a moral standard to hold somebody to ask them to not butcher journalists. That's what Lindsey Graham is arguing for, is that if they're butchering journalists who live and work in the United States, that's a step too far. And at that point, we have to call off weapons sales. And Sean Hannity is saying that's a ridiculously tough standard. We can't hold our allies to that. And Iran is so evil that, no matter what the Saudis do, and never mind, they don't even discuss, the Saudi role in Syria, the Saudi role in 9/11, the Saudi role in the genocidal war in Yemen. All they could discuss is that, this like little thing is that if it's too much to butcher a journalist.
Right, and notice that the entire premise of the conversation, too, or at least of Hannity's argument, is that it's all, Iran. They're going to get a nuclear weapon. That's his nightmare scenario over and over again. But if you actually look at that claim and kind of soberly analyze it, no, Iran has over and over again been found to not be, pursuing nuclear weapons. Even the IAEA says this. And so that's just like a ridiculous premise there. But it's interesting. Lindsey Graham sort of like his mixed messages. He's saying, it's not that high of a standard to, to ask that we don't butcher a journalist in a consulate. And so we have to, go and show who's the new sheriff in town, as if that hasn't been the role of the United States, not only in the Middle East, but elsewhere too. So like it's two crazy people talking to each other, like Kyle said. There's so many like mixed messages and like false premises and stuff buried in there. But Lindsey Graham does sort of on accident come out the more reasonable one, sort of saying this isn't World War II. It's not Hitler isn't always about to take over the world. Iran is not Hitler. He didn't say that explicitly, but sort of suggested that this is not the similar, scenario as World War II. And so that was good at least. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of sense to make out of those either position there.
And like I think it points out that their red line being the Khashoggi murder, it just doesn't make any sense. And they're already hinting at what their real goals and all. Why don't they just drop this whole thing? Like, why did it have to be the Khashoggi murder when it's a ridiculous red line to have? But they're just so used to, fabricating these narratives that they're stuck in it. And frankly, I don't know where. I don't even know what's driving Lindsey Graham at this point. I think he pretended to be Trump's ally, but he's really not.
Yeah, I think some of what's driving this of just like the total outrage with Khashoggi, as opposed to like the slaughter in Yemen, where tens of thousands of people are dying, is that, and I think Scott Horton has made this point on his show too, is that like Yemen is sort of a statistic. It's very tragic, but it's just like a sea of nameless faces. Whereas when it's one guy, one high-profile guy, it's much easier to make a big scandal and make that a high-profile incident. And I think a lot of people are, as I kind of suggested earlier, are just kind of like opportunistically pouncing on this. And, I think there are other people with deeper motives and stuff that are using this too, but a lot of it I think is sort of just shallow.
Yeah, and frankly and sadly, I don't think they're that upset about Yemen either. I don't think they really want to end the Yemen war. I think they want to go back to the way Obama was. You have to remember, right? This war started in the previous administration. But, that administration and that faction prefers to fight this more covertly, in a different way, not this like blatant putting the country under siege and bomb, it's too public, it's too bloody, it's too violent, and they're doing, again, Trump is doing it wrong and MBS is doing it wrong. And in this case, it looks like Trump doesn't even have any. Looks like Trump wants to quiet it down too, but MBS is, not staying in line. Yeah, so we have that, and then we have Rand Paul, who also spoke out on this, and we also have Tulsi Gabbard, who she's been going now. To her credit, and Rand Paul's, both of them have been trying to end this war, our support for the war in Yemen, for a long time, unlike Lindsey Graham. But, Tulsi Gabbard came out and nailed Trump. She said, where I have it here. So she was already angry, about the war in Yemen because there was a bill or an amendment or a measure in Congress to stop our support for the Saudis' war in Yemen. And, support for that was growing until the Republicans did like a dirty trick. They buried some language in a bill about wolves and wildlife. And what it really did was it stopped the vote on ending our support for the war in Yemen. So she was pretty pissed about that. And she came out on Twitter and she said, "Hey, real Donald Trump, being Saudi Arabia's bitch is not America's first." And that, of course, blew up all over the place. She later did a Twitter thread that sort of expanded on that controversial tweet, but she doesn't apologize for it. She doubles down and sort of explains it in a more less controversial way. You guys, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But she says aloha means love, including love for others, our country, and our values. Sometimes aloha manifests as righteous anger, like the anger we feel when our president portrays our country as Saudi Arabia's slave. Donald Trump weakly submits that our country must do Saudi Arabia's bidding. or absurdly, our economy and national security interests will be damaged. He ridiculously calls his policy of submissiveness to Saudi Arabia America first, when it's obviously Saudi Arabia first. So the president believes that we must please the Saudis by continuing to stop the Saudi genocide in Yemen that has killed thousands of civilians and starved 85,000 children to death. And we must quietly accept their practice of slaughtering reporters, beheading dissidents, persecuting Christians and other religious minorities, and atheists. And we must turn a blind eye to their spending billions to spread the radical ideology of Wahhabism around the world, the very ideology that fuels Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terrorists. Every American who has aloha, love for our country, should reject the president's demeaning view and portrayal of our great nation. So, you know, there's a lot I could say about that.
Yeah, I thought that was great. I thought it was a great move by Gabbard there. Like, she's sort of attacking Trump from his right flank, saying this isn't America first, like throwing that back in his face instead of trying to make some. I mean, of course, humanitarian arguments are fine, but I don't know if they're that effective toward Trump and sort of Trump people. I think more attacking the nationalism of it, or this isn't America first. I thought that was just a good move by her.
Yeah, she nailed him. I mean, she really did. And then
I mean, just to highlight what Will's saying here, it's obvious at this point that Trump does not care what the Democrats have to say about the human rights of brown people, but he does seem to care about the American first message. So this is, absolutely brilliant. And, the old Scott Horton attack, the right from the right, the left from the left kind of notion there. And she does a good job of it. And I also think, by calling him a bitch, she does a pretty good job of that too. Just being what's wrong with you, Trump? Are you, MBS's, little boy? This is like I saw a week ago. He had a press conference, and somebody said, "Trump, you haven't gone to active war zone. Why haven't you gone?" He's like, "Oh, I'm going to one soon." He just can't help himself.
Yeah, they're finally getting it, of how to go after this guy. Anyway, here's Rand Paul. He's on Face the Nation, so he's got a big audience here too.
What do you make of the president's remarks?
Well, the Crown Prince, his brother, made a phone call to Khashoggi, the dissident that was killed and dismembered. And that phone call was to tell Khashoggi, hey, it's fine. You can go to the consulate. No one will harm you. Well, we have the Crown Prince's brother making that phone call. I think we have other intelligence that may link brothers' phone calls back to the Crown Prince. I think the evidence is overwhelming that the Crown Prince was involved. And so, no, I don't think we can sweep this under the rug. The thing about sanctions is that I think sanctions are pretending to do something without really doing anything. Most of these people are in prison other than the Crown Prince. But the Crown Prince runs the country and we deal with him. If we put sanctions on people who are in prison, are we really doing anything to punish them? They're already in prison. We need to punish who ordered this, who's in charge. And really the only thing they understand over there is strength. I think they will see sanctions as weakness on the part of the president. And if the president wants to act strongly, he should cut off the arms sale. Not only because of the killing, but until they stop bombing civilian populations. Mm-hmm. Secretary Pompeo told Saudi Arabia 3 weeks ago, stop bombing civilian populations. Since then, Saudi Arabia has bombed cities 200 times. They're not listening.
You're talking
They're
about
indiscriminately bombing civilians. Yes,
you're talking about in Yemen. I should point out Saudi Arabia disputes the reporting that there was a phone call between Prince Khalid and Jamal Khashoggi. They say that's just not true. But given the CIA assessment overall that says there was a role, do you think this needs to trigger some other kind of change in policy? You're on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Are you going to try to block the appointment of the appointed ambassador?
Realize the Saudis have told us a lot of things that were untrue. They told us it was a fist fight that went bad. They told us he was alive. They had a body double there to try to trick people into believing he was still alive. So the Saudis have been duplicitous since the very beginning. Do we need to do more? Yes. But at the very least, we need to quit selling arms to people who lie to us.
The president says that's exactly why, though. Those arms sales are exactly why the relationship is important, and he's not going to hurt the economic benefits.
Yeah. here's my point. The arms sales don't make us safer. They make us less safe. When we sell arms to a foreign country, it should not ever be for jobs. It should be for our national security. The Saudis involving us in their war in Yemen is a disaster. 17 million people live on the edge of starvation. If we get involved in another civil war in the Middle East, that's not good for our national security. That just drains our natural resources. Yeah, I'd quit arming the Saudis. The Saudis are bombing to the tune of tens of thousands of bombs in Yemen.
Is there anything you can do? Because the president says he's going to continue selling.
Right, yeah. I've introduced resolution after resolution to stop selling arms. We've done it twice, and it's a privileged resolution, meaning they can't prevent me from getting a vote. Mm-hmm. First time I got 20-something votes. The second time, with the help of a Democrat Senator, Chris Murphy, we got 47 votes. If we have another vote, I think we could almost get to a veto-proof majority. But guess what? They're not bringing any arms sales up right now because they know we might beat them.
What about the ambassador who's been nominated here, General John Abizaid? You going to vote to confirm him?
I want to meet with him, and I don't think that really, my first impulse is that's not the way to sort of punish Saudi Arabia by blocking an ambassador. I'm a big believer in dialogue, and even with this, I wouldn't stop trading oil with Saudi Arabia, but I would stop selling them arms. That's the first thing I would do. That doesn't disrupt trade, doesn't disrupt diplomacy. It just sends them a very strong message. We're not going to keep fueling your war in Yemen, which is a total disaster. And everybody's saying there's no military solution, and yet nobody's willing to do anything that would actually force Saudi Arabia to stop the war. If we were not refueling, if we were not providing spare parts for their American-made planes, the war would be over in a matter of months, because you have to have a continuous supply of spare parts and people to repair your planes and train your pilots. If we quit doing that, Saudi Arabia would quit bombing them within 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, so, I think that Tulsi Gabbard and Rand Paul genuinely want to end this war in Yemen, and I think that's the driving factor for them. They see a major league opportunity here. The other people involved, I think, is more complicated, but this is a pretty strong coalition. I don't see Trump winning this one. The problem is, how do they remove MBS from power?
Right. That's sort of been my question, too. It's just like, we can see very clearly when they want to sort of remove someone, you want to, change a regime in Libya or Syria or even Iran. You can see sort of like more concrete sort of steps being taken toward that. So with Saudi, the Dawn thing with, Khashoggi's organization may have been something to do with that sort of early stages of trying to shake things up in Saudi. But yeah, like what would the next move be if you did want to, do that? If you did want to overthrow Mohammed bin Salman, it just seems like, given the consolidated, decision-making structure in Saudi now too, it'd be even harder.
Yeah, I think they want Trump and Netanyahu to tell MBS to force him to back down, basically. And, Trump's not cooperating with that. But, I mean, he was a little shaky on this in the beginning. I'm not quite so sure how long he's going to stand behind MBS. But the problem is that most of the people who are trying to push him into this, he doesn't trust them because of, everything they've done up to this point. I mean, he totally doesn't trust them. So it's a definitely a dilemma.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to add. I thought Rand's analysis was pretty good, and his recommendations as well. I mean, I don't think the solution is to necessarily have regime change in Saudi Arabia or anything like that. But at the same time, let's just stop selling them weapons and aiding the terrible things they do overseas. I think that's the best. I think that's where Rand's the best, is kind of giving this very appropriate response as far as the situation at hand. And of course, the interviewer is absolutely hostile towards him. Like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And he's, just calmly explaining the position. So I think he does a good job.
Yeah, I agree with that, definitely, with that take of Rand's appearance there. One thing that I perhaps should have brought up earlier, but that I think I can sort of tie into the Rand Paul interview there, is Rand talks about the call that allegedly was intercepted by the CIA, or that the CIA leaked, apparently, that the CIA leaked to officials who then talked to the Washington Post. There's several layers of people. But the call from Mohammed bin Salman's brother, Khalid, that apparently he, encouraged Khashoggi to go ahead and go to the consulate. There was another, though, something in the Washington Post that I have not seen many people talk about. There's a piece in the Washington Post entitled "Saudis are said to have lain in wait for Jamal Khashoggi," And way buried in, like 10 paragraphs in, it has this paragraph real quick. It says, before Khashoggi's disappearance, U.S. intelligence intercepted communications of Saudi officials discussing a plan to capture him, according to a person familiar with the information, which seems to me to be a second leak. And sort of it reminded me when he brought up the Khalid thing that the CIA has this thing called a duty to warn, that like they have like there's an intelligence community directive that says that like if they have information that a U.S. citizen or a non-U.S. citizen, any U.S. person or non-U.S. person, if they're sort of like in bodily danger of death or kidnapping or something, they're supposed to warn them. And this is something that actually the Moon of Alabama blog brings up. And so that is just a fascinating aspect to me, that like there was at least one CIA sort of leak, but there seems to have been another one here in the Washington Post, and that in neither case they didn't warn Khashoggi, even though they seem to have had foreknowledge.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember somebody asking John Brennan about that, and he sort of wiggled his way out of it. They said to him, like, didn't you guys, why did you let Khashoggi even go into that embassy? If you could have saved him, why didn't you warn him? And don't you have a duty to do that? Isn't that the law? And Brennan, I'm pretty sure he cited some kind of a loophole, like, well, yeah, that is the rule, but if there's national security or if it would reveal sources and methods, then, we don't have to. So
right.
He bailed him out of that.
Bernard at Moon of Alabama suggested, maybe this came from the British, because there's also reports in the Express that the GCHQ had like intercepted stuff of a similar nature of Saudi officials discussing this, and that maybe it came from a foreign intelligence source. Sources and methods kind of stuff. I don't know. It all gets pretty murky there.
Yeah, the whole Bruce Riedel and John Brennan thing just sticks with me, because really from early on I think basically from the point in time when MBS, when the king technically inserted MBS into the line to the throne, I'm pretty sure that the people who are against him, thought that there would be a way to change that somewhere down the line. And I think there are a number of indications that they're getting worried because, one, they're afraid the king's going to die, or that the king's going to abdicate. And even if he names MBS, apparently there's a council that has to agree to it. And they're worried that it's going to end up, being messy, that it's not going to be a clean transition. Or, they're worried that it will be a clean transition, that MBS will get in there, because apparently he does still have a lot of support at home, even though he's got a lot of enemies. But once he becomes king, apparently, he's sort of untouchable. Like the fact that they mentioned the palace that he built for his father seems to me more like an abdication situation. And I know some people thought that early 2019? I mean, they thought that this was going to happen before now or around now. So there's certainly an urgency. Plus, Saudi Arabia is running out of money. It's just a precarious situation. I think they're just afraid that it's not going to be an easy transition, and not the way they, have planned it. But the other thing that I found interesting about a lot of this material we've gone through is that there's a lot of veiled threats, thinly veiled threats in these things. And a few of them are, I think that Riedel early on, and even more so in an interview he did on this podcast called Off the Hookah, I think he buries a veiled threat in that. And I think that he's been doing that since that article he did in September. Like, he has to sleep on his yacht, and the Saudis have been throwing threats around. And I thought the Al-Wali bin Talal interview with Maria Bartiromo, he brings up Abu Ghraib, which is a pretty, I don't think I've ever heard the Saudis bring something like that up. But then Prince Turki Al Faisal, you got to listen to this. So this is Turki Al Faisal. He's the son of the late King Faisal. He's the former Saudi intelligence chief. And I always thought he was, closely tied with our intelligence, but I don't know. Well, wait till you hear what he says. But anyway, he's at an event just a few days ago. And what is this event? It's an event hosted by the New York-based Beirut Institute. And also, importantly, he worked closely with Khashoggi. Khashoggi worked as a spokesman in London and Washington before he switched over to his new prince, Al-Walid bin Talal. So anyway, he gives a talk, and then he gives some interviews.
Well, I thought President Trump was expressing what he felt was in the interest of the United States. He emphasized the strategic relationship between the two countries in the same statement, and how Saudi Arabia has been helpful in many instances, not just oil. He mentioned the fight against terrorism. He mentioned peace efforts. He mentioned various other things where Saudi Arabia and the United States over the years have worked together. So it wasn't just an oil for support statement, but a recognition by the President of the United States of the importance of the kingdom in the world today. I wouldn't take that as divine revelation, or biblical certainty, or Quranic verses. Those same intelligence organizations are not necessarily as accurate as they should be, according to their own history of their assessments of previous efforts. Just to remind you, the invasion of Iraq was based on so-called intelligence estimates by that same organization that produced this remarkably flawed assessment about this incident.
I just wanted to say that what Turkey Al-Faisal is referring to there is the CIA assessment. I mean, I guess Al-Walid and Turkey, I mean, maybe they're scared to death and they have to do MBS talking points. But I don't know, this seemed more like fighting words. Slamming the CIA assessment.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely pretty harsh coming out of a Saudi official like that. Although I guess it's just sort of like it's tit for tat. He's like, okay, you guys want to put something out against us? Well, I'm gonna do the same. But yeah, it's odd though, because you'd think that bin Talal and Prince Faisal bin Turkey, they're sort of, as far as I knew, they were on sort of the more like pro Khashoggi faction, or they would be. Both of them had dealings with him. And so, yeah, perhaps they are just like being like cowed into this completely, because that would make sense too, with Al-Walid being locked up in the Ritz-Carlton and stuff. Maybe he doesn't want that to happen again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be that they're signaling too. They're just, with their past ties to Khashoggi, they're just like, yeah, that CIA assessment is real wrong, and really trying to sell to Mohammed bin Salman that they're on board.
Although I will say it is kind of odd. It does seem sort of like those two talking points, about the one with Abu Ghraib and the other just talking about the Iraq war generally, like WMD intelligence or whatever. Those do sound oddly similar of talking points. It sounds like they're coming from somewhere. It's being maybe disseminated from some central, I don't know, perhaps not. Maybe it's a coincidence.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Well, let's see. Before we wrap up, anything else? How should we wrap this up? Maybe I'll mention there is an article. I don't want to read the whole thing, but it's gotten a lot of press, and it's from the president of the Atlantic Council. His name is Fred Kempe, from the Atlantic Council president. And, the Atlantic Council is funded by Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, weapons manufacturers. It's published on CNBC, and it's titled, "Here's a Saudi War Game Scenario that demonstrates the peril of post-Khashoggi period for the U.S. and the Middle East." And at the top of it, there are some bullet points that sort of summarize it. It says, a nightmare scenario involving a potential armed showdown between Saudi Arabia and Iran would put America and President Trump in a high-stakes dilemma. Then the next bullet point is, U.S. policy performs best when focused on longer-term strategic purpose, In the Middle East, the approach must be on preventing any new conflicts, ending civil wars, and unlocking the region's human potential while opposing extremism. And then the last bullet point is the U.S. and its Western allies should leverage the post-Khashoggi crisis to achieve some good in the Middle East. And I think the takeaway that a lot of people took from this is that it was it was sort of advice to MBS and to everybody, just sort of like how to get past this. And there was, people that were pretty outraged about it. I agree with them for the most part. But what they didn't talk about was what I thought was a veiled threat. And he says, even in a region that, let me just read you what the scenario he lays out. He says a Middle Eastern government analyst, when asked what risk keeps him awake at night, frames the scenario this way. Iran-backed Houthi militia in Yemen break a fragile ceasefire with a missile launched at Riyadh, the Saudi capital. Unlike so many before it, this missile slips through the Saudi air defenses and lands on a shopping mall in early evening, the busiest time of day. The strike takes mass casualties that sets off panic. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, already rattled by U.S. and European backlash from the Khashoggi killing, blames Tehran for the attack, knowing he must respond, but is unsure what allies he can count on. Advisors argue that he must strike Iran itself, given the scale of the carnage, the pointlessness of striking targets in Yemen, and questions swirling about his leadership. However, he lacks the offensive and defensive wherewithal for a sustained war with Iran. He considers two options: a secure call to President Donald Trump to request he join the Saudi allies against their common foe, or alternatively, the Saudi Air Force strikes Iran, provoking a counterstrike that it hopes will bring some American allies into the fighting. In either case, the U.S. president is left to decide: double down on a tainted ally or stand aside and risk those consequences. So, I think he's basically saying lay off MBS, or, this is the way it could play out. So, stop with this, regime change operation. And I see little threats being thrown back and forth. Well, big threats. They're not overt. They're sort of veiled. And I don't know. It's a dangerous situation. But when I see things like this, it makes me even more worried.
Right. Like if it just had come from some, lowly columnist somewhere, that might make a little, might be a little different. But we're talking about what you said, the Atlantic Council, like the director or the head of the Atlantic Council, NATO's think tank.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's definitely a bit more significant when that,
Yeah. So what was our last point there? Just to try to wrap this up in a way that's, our last point was our analysis on what's really going on. Any more thoughts on, what you think is really going on with this Khashoggi affair?
Yeah, I guess just in summary, I'd say that I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't know and probably can't know, at least at the moment. There's a lot of just inner, the inner factions of what would be called the deep state or something in multiple countries are sort of operating. There's Turkish intelligence, there's American, there's the Saudi, security apparatus, there's all kinds of regional interests involved here. Definitely, though, there's a domestic political component to this in the United States, where there are people using this entire Khashoggi scandal as sort of a weapon against the president. And perhaps their motivations don't go much deeper than that. It's purely just to sling mud at him. But yeah, I think there's a lot that's being said about Khashoggi, or a lot that's not being said about Khashoggi and sort of his ties and his, his role in Saudi society. Certainly, I think that's something that people should keep in mind. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's about it.
Yeah, to kind of expand on that, the interesting thing about this Khashoggi murder is that, as far as I could tell, there's really no independent journalism on this whatsoever. Everything's a leak from the government or speculation. And so, now, we're trusting all of our information coming from three governments, I would rank as some of the most deceptive in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. And so, that leaves us, to talk about this, talking about the political motives of all these different factions. But the interesting part is that like anything could still happen. It does seem that Khashoggi's dead, and that's significant, seeing as he was living in the U.S., was working for the Washington Post, and this has become a major issue, and most importantly for Mohammed bin Salman. And the Trump response has been incredibly interesting, and I think it will have some impact on especially the media coverage that's going to be paid not only to the Khashoggi murder but to the war in Yemen, and to a lesser extent the blockade on the Qatar.
Yeah, I'm hoping that if there's any silver lining to this thing, that the war in Yemen gets ended. I think it also reflects on the whole, the realignment, the moving from a single superpower to multipolar world, and the lack of confidence, the fear of the decline of the American empire, and Russia and China's growing influence, everywhere, but certainly in the Middle East, because, the Syria war didn't turn out the way it was supposed to. And I think that all the powers in that region are now seeing Russia in a new light. And it's almost like they can say, if the U.S. is pushing them around too much or asking them to do something they don't want to do or they don't think is in their best interest, they can kind of do exactly what MBS did, which is saying, well, we'll just go and side with Russia, And I think there's a real fear that kind of thing could happen. China's been very quiet, but I think that their influence with Saudi Arabia is growing. Russia and Saudi Arabia are certainly not enemies, and so I think that's a factor too that probably just raises the heat on all of this, and frankly raises the danger in this situation and makes it more complicated and more precarious, in my view. So anyway, with that, I mean, this is such a big subject. We could go on forever, but I think we better end it here. And why don't you guys tell everybody where people can find your work and how they can support you?
So I guess to make it easy, the Libertarian Institute, you could find mine and Will's work. I think pretty much everything we do ends up getting published there at some point, whether it's on the blog, the featured articles column. My daily news roundup is there on the homepage, as well as my podcast, Foreign Policy Focus. That's mostly what I'm doing. I'm the host of that. I do run the website immersionnews.com, where I post a lot of news stories and stuff like that. My Patreon page is patreon.com/foreign policy focus. And I'm telling everybody to check out, if you're tired of, kind of the social media, Facebook, Twitter stuff, check out minds.com. I'm minds.com/immersion news. It's a pretty cool new crypto-based social media decentralized platform.
Cool.
Yeah, definitely check out Minds. I'm on there too. Minds.com/Will Porter. It's a great new social media thing, and it's a lot of the crap that you don't like about Twitter and Facebook is not there. But yeah, as Kyle said, you can find a lot of my writing at the libertarianinstitute.org, in the featured articles in the blog section, sometimes at antiwar.com in the viewpoint section. I've got like 100 articles or something at a site called the Daily Sheeple. It's all on mostly foreign policy stuff. There's some like domestic police stories there. But yeah, if you guys like what I do as a freelancer, you can also support me at patreon.com/WKP journalist.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate it, and look forward to next time we grab a subject and do this again. But take care, and thanks so much.
Yeah, I had a blast. Thanks a lot, Joanne.
And that's part 2, the last episode in this series. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter. Follow Kyle on Twitter at KYAAALE. Subscribe to his podcast, Foreign Policy Focus, and find his work at immersionnews.com and libertarianinstitute.org. Also, support him at Patreon, patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus. Follow Will Porter on Twitter at WKPANCAP. Find his work at Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and Consortium News, and support him at patreon.com/WKP Journalist. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media. brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can pitch in, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or do one-time donations on our website at aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at aroundtheempire. Helps a lot if you hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel, and that's free. That will help us get to the number of subscribers to where we can do live stream super chats. Also, use the thumbs up icon to like the individual videos. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or any of your favorite radio and podcast apps. We're on pretty much all of them: Spotify, iHeart, Google. If you like the podcast, take a minute to leave a nice review. It helps a lot. And lastly, please like our page on Facebook. See you next time. Take care, everyone.